Hello, and welcome to 3 things that you should do now to avoid a combustible dust event, brought to you by SonicAire. I know we've got people joining us from all around the world this morning. We've got folks all over North America and Europe, and we are so excited that you are here with us. I'm Jordan Newton. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at SonicAire, and I'll be your host today. I want to let you know that as we're talking, if you have any questions, make sure to pop them into the Q&A section. You should have a button there at the bottom of the screen that you can open that up and type them in. We'll answer as many as we can as time allows, and anything that we can't cover in our session today, we'll be sure to respond to you individually and make sure we get those questions answered. Well, today I'm talking with Dr. Chris Cloney, founder of Dust Safety Science and the host of the Dust Safety Science podcast. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, Jordan, really excited to be here and really excited to talk to you and the group that you have on here today.
Thanks. Yeah, Chris and I have worked together and collaborated on a few things and haven't really had a time to just sit down and dialogue about safety and dust. So I'm looking forward to our session today.
Yeah, me as well.
All right. So tell us a little bit about Dust Safety Science. What is it? What do you want people to know about it? And what's currently going on with you and your team?
Yeah, so our company is DustX Research Limited, but the platforms most people will see us on is Dust Safety Science, Dust Safety Academy, and Dust Safety Professionals. And really the whole group of platforms was around an idea about combustible dust I had while doing my PhD research. So I started about a decade ago in 2011, 2012, looking at the physics and chemistry of dust explosions, traveling around the world, talking to researchers, looking at really small scale laminar dust flames and people going out in outer space and rockets and doing, aluminum dust investigations to, laboratories. There's probably 100 around the world blowing up stuff in these small 20-liter spheres. And it was really interesting. I loved it. I love combustion science. I love explosion research. I was very interested in explosion, detonation, blast, shockwave physics. But when I came to the industrial application side and sort of said, okay, well, what are we doing here as researchers? I kind of quickly realized that there's this big disconnect. I'd be at these events talking to people about this really interesting science, but there's nobody from industry there. And then I go to Powder and Bulk Solids in Chicago and it'd be a massive, array of industries, and there'd be no scientists there. And I sort of started looking around. Okay, well, who else is missing? It's like, okay, well, the regulators have a big role to play, and are they here? Well, not really. They're doing their own thing, and they have 1,000 tasks to do, and only 10 people to do it. And the process safety specialists were there as well, but they're having difficulties connecting with the industry. So it's really this kind of disparate group of folks involved in combustible dust, and that's really where the genesis of things like the podcast came from, to say, okay, well, how can we start closing these gaps? How can we better understand safety? Get these groups to communicate. It's just been one gap after another with these platforms, identifying through what we're doing, through the independent research that we create, and then saying, okay, how do we close that gap? How do we increase safety in combustible dust handling industries?
Sure. I know I heard a quote yesterday that said, someone who knows what to do and how to do it will always have a job, but someone who knows the why will always have authority, and not just know how to do things, but have authority in that space. And so I think you've spoken to your why a little bit behind that. So I appreciate you expanding on that and sharing that with us. All right, so let's jump right into combustible dust. And so what's the big deal? What's the big issue? Why is combustible dust such a critical element of safety? Why do regulators care, and why should we care?
Yeah, there's this really, I don't know if it's famous or infamous, but this word that's used by the Chemical Safety Board on combustible dust, and they called it I can't think actually the word they use now, but like a latent hazard. Hazard just sort of sits around and nobody thinks too much about it until something bad happens. And that word will come to me later in this interview, and I'll say what it is. But it's, that kind of thing that just sort of sits around, and when it does go wrong, it can be devastating, and it often is. But when it's not, then it seems pretty, innocuous or doesn't really hurt a whole lot. And there's some terminology issues that we have as a community, but it's just dust. It's the same stuff that's, on my dresser here. We're talking about housekeeping, so we're cleaning up little fluffy things. It's very inconspicuous. That can be a hazard, but it turns out when you look at it with a critical eye, it is quite a big hazard in terms of fires, in terms of flash fires and deflagrations, and in terms of explosions. So that's like the latent issue behind everything. Is it seems relatively safe. But when you look out of the critical eye, then you realize, well, actually, there's quite a few people being hurt every year with this. So we have an incident database, tracks globally. We have 1,000 recorded incidents since we started in 2017, 2016. And in the US, there's 30 major, whatever you want to call major, dust explosions every year. And that is generally ones that are large enough to make the local news. That means that we usually capture them in the database. There's about 30 injuries a year. And we see anywhere from 1 to 5 fatalities a year on average. And then every 7 to 10 years, there's a really bad year where you have a whole lot more. And that's where the big spikes in awareness and the big spikes in pressure and combustible dust come from. But those are two things. I mean, it's a real challenging industry that is causing loss. We talk about life and limb, but it causes a lot of property loss, a lot of product loss as well, a lot of downtime. It's this latent hazard, just sort of kicks around until it does nothing until it does something. And then it's really disparate. There's a whole lot of materials that can be involved and a whole lot of equipment that can be involved and a whole lot of process that can happen that could cause loss. So to wrap your arms around it, to wrap your head around it can be quite difficult. And I'd say that even, there's only a couple people in the world that have wrapped their head around all of it, if you can even call it that. Most people have their own little chunk that they understand and they develop and they work from.
Sure.
So those are the three things: really hard to wrap your head around, very disparate, causes real loss in the industry, and it's this latent hazard just sort of kicks around until something bad happens. So we sort of forget that it's bad until these things happen.
Yeah, it's kind of that sleeping giant, right?
Yeah.
It's and it's complex and it's dangerous for sure. Okay, so if I'm a plant manager, if I'm a facility operator, I'm an EH&S manager, what are the most important things I should do to avoid a combustible dust event? What are some things I can do now? Let's talk about those three things.
Yeah, so I try to pick out three that I thought would be really kind of helpful for people to take away today. And the three that I came up with was just an on-site facility assessment. And generally here you're looking for explosion hazards outside of equipment, and we can talk about what that means. A dust hazard analysis, which is more of extensive review on this. You start looking inside equipment, start looking at fires, flash fire, and explosion hazards. And the third is emergency pre-planning, and in particular, safer response to fires and thermal events. Those are like the three key areas. So get somebody in and at least get an eye on your system, see where you're at. Do this comprehensive dust hazard analysis. We can talk about that. And then one of the major avenues of loss that we see is that there's a thermal event. Something gets hot, something is smoking, some gas builds up in a piece of equipment because of some sort of combustion or even non-combustion event. You have an open fire, and those are all mechanisms that then can escalate and cause a large explosion. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but those are three things: facility assessment, DHAs, and emergency pre-planning.
Yeah. So let's talk about that assessment and the explosions outside of equipment. What should we be looking for? Where do we begin? Where do we even get started on something like that? Yeah,
I mean, so generally, and this, some people might say you should just start right with a dust hazard analysis, and maybe some people should. But there are facilities out there that don't know whether or not they fall under NFPA 652, the fundamentals of combustible dust. And there are facilities out there that aren't necessarily at the stage to take the full action on dust hazard analysis, but we still want them to have safer operations. So these are some of the cases where a facility assessment comes in. I think there's really three key things you're looking for in assessment. Where's the fuel? Is there fuel available for a fire or explosion? Where are the ignition sources? Are they available for fires or explosions? And also then you're looking at screening testing. So, okay, if we want to go down the route of NFPA 652 and understanding if that applies, then we need to get our material tested, or we can opt in and just say, yep, the second step, DHAs are needed. But a lot of time companies want to know whether or not that's needed, and that's where your screening test comes in.
Yeah, I thought that was the case. Yeah, people can just say, we're not sure if it's combustible or not, but everybody in our industry treats it like combustible dust. So chances are it's combustible. They can just skip right over that testing step and just go, we're dealing with combustible dust. Let's take it head on, right? They can choose that route.
Exactly. And I think, I'm not sure the exact verbiage in 652, but it's something like you can use historical data to opt in.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a caution there. Don't use historical data unless you're really sure, and there's some funny wording there on your explosion protection equipment. Because if you're wrong, you may undersize your vents.
Sure.
You may have inappropriate timings on your fire extinguishing systems or your explosion suppression systems.
Sure.
There's things that come in there.
And we definitely want to be careful not to use that historical data to opt out, right? You can't opt out with that, but you can opt in.
And we're really trying to avoid false negatives. No one should opt out of a dust hazard analysis process if you actually need to identify those hazards, because generally you're going to find out the hard way that you no longer could opt out when you have a fire or explosion.
Yeah. Okay, so we've identified fuel, ignition, and then testing. So I got asked, I was at a trade show recently, and I got asked, who are some testing labs you've worked with, or where do I go for that? And I actually had one of my colleagues that was there with me said, hey, shouldn't they check out Chris's website? And I said, that's the best resource. That's the best place to go. So if I asked you today, Chris, I don't know where to begin to get testing. Where can I go to find a reputable testing laboratory? Where can we go for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason we created Dust Safety Professionals as a platform, because we kept getting that question over and over again. It's like, okay, well, let's systematize this and get all the testing houses on board. So through Dust Safety Professionals, we have member companies from Canada through the US, multiple in the US, to Asia, to Europe, to India. So wherever you are in the world, and most people are tuning this might be North America based. You just go to Dust Safety Professionals. You can look at the list we have there, or just put a request and say, hey, Dust Safety Professionals team, I need help with this. And we get that quite a bit. It could be a steel manufacturer that their AHJ has come in and said, hey, you gotta figure this out. You gotta do a DHA. And they go, well, we don't really know if this applies. So they go to Dust Safety Professionals, enter that information, then we work with them and say, okay, well, you're not really at the testing stage yet. Maybe you need a consultant to come in and do a facility assessment. The nice thing about most facility assessments is they can roll into a DHA generally. Your DHA is a multi-day process. Day one is generally the assessment anyway. So if you're working with a good consultant, and we have many of them in Dust Safety Professionals as well, they'll be able to do a sort of a dual quote. So if you do your testing, it turns out, hey, this doesn't apply, then they'll help you with your AHJs a lot of time, understand that there's no hazards there. And if they do go down the road of doing a full dust hazard analysis, and that will contribute towards that.
So you mentioned a term that I'm familiar with, but some of our folks that are watching today may not be as familiar with. You mentioned AHJ. So can you elaborate on that, and who is that typically? When we talk about an AHJ, who exactly are we talking about in most cases?
Yes, the easy to say but hard to define AHJ.
Right.
It's really kind of a catch-all term that industry has put together to capture a lot of people. So one way to think about it is anyone who has the power to shut you down is an AHJ, and they take many forms. So it can be your local fire marshal, it can be your local building code enforcement agent, it can be the person who has to sign off on your site plans. It can be your insurance. If you can't operate without insurance, then your insurance is your AHJ. More commonly, you might see an OSHA official being named your authority having jurisdiction. Those are some of the different ones that you might be looking at. But I mean, when we get requests through Dust Safety Professionals, it's generally somebody has told me, like a local authority or building official has come in and said, hey, you need to do this. And then they're at that stage and they don't really know. If they're already going to trade shows and they're immersed in combustible dust, they probably already know that they need to go to step 2 already. So their AHJs might not be, their local jurisdiction may already be past that stage of telling them they need to move ahead.
Okay. All right. Step 1, identify the fuel, identify those ignition points, and look for a testing resource to find out if your dust actually is combustible. All right. Anything else on explosions outside of the equipment, just kind of in that outside environment?
Yeah, I want to give sort of framework for people to think about it. And one of the ways you'll hear explained is, at least for the fuel side, is contain, collect, clean. So the 3 C's. A lot of companies just start with clean. So every time there's dust, we clean it up. And that's can be a good strategy. It's generally not the most efficient strategy. It's better to say, how can we keep this dust inside the equipment? So if you have leaks, if you have improper equipment design, those are all ways that containment of that dust inside your equipment can be a challenge. And there's ways to fix that. Better equipment design, better conveyor system design. Generally, you see conveyors that drop just from one to another, and that causes a dust cloud, and that dust then migrates.
Sure.
We can design that as I think they call them a scoop and spoon, but a different design avenue. So you get laminar powder over that conveyor, and you don't get that dust kicking up. You can add in wetting, depending on the industry, or you can add in like solvents to keep your dust levels down. There's lots of ways to contain that dust in the powder stream, or to contain inside the equipment. And feed, maybe you want to screen that dust out before you even ever hit your facility. Maybe you only want to buy corn that's been pre-screened so that you don't have that dust that's coming out. So there's a lot of steps you can take on containment that are going to really make it easier to clean at the end of the day.
Yeah. What about filtration maintenance? I get asked about that occasionally. My understanding is that over time, if you don't do proper maintenance of your filter system, the performance is going to degrade. Is that something you have experience with, or something that kind of falls into this contain category here?
Yeah, it's really the second piece, collect. So if you can't contain the equipment, then you want to collect it at your transfer points generally. And dust collection, there's this local dentist I hear on the radio, and every morning they play the same thing. So it's sort of drummed in my head. It says, what does he say? It's happy-go-lucky voice on it. You don't need to take care of all your teeth, just the ones you want to keep. It's like, well, you don't have to take care of all your dust collection equipment, but just the ones you want to function well.
Right.
So it's generally abrasive material. Can be sticky. There's powder involved, and efficiency is going to degrade over time of a dust collection system. They do need maintenance. They do need upkeep, and in some circumstances, they can also be a challenge too, because they've added in a lot of the elements needed for a dust explosion are inherent in a dust collection equipment. Often containing can be a better strategy, containment. Not always though. I mean, there's other cases where dust collection is superbly working. If you got a dust collector and there's like dust all around it, or all around the pickup points, then you're probably not really maximizing your efficiency with dust. It should be capturing, I don't know what the match number is, but let's say somewhere between 70 and 95% of the material that's coming through it. And the good designers would probably say, above 90%. If you're not capturing everything with the dust collection equipment, it's not designed or kept going very well.
So with that 25 to 10% or whatever that escapes, that's what we call fugitive dust. So I think that's where the clean comes in. And so let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so that's the third C. So contain, collect, clean. Traditional, so for cleaning, you really want to then get that out of your facility in a safe manner. The traditional method to do that, and when I say traditional, maybe historical method might be just to blow it down to the ground and sweep it up. It turns out that was causing more incidents than it was saving at the end of the day, because you're creating that dust cloud in the vicinity of the employees. So that's really frowned upon, and really can only be done as per an FPA under very specific circumstances that are generally more onerous than using other cleaning methods. So you really want to, at a frequency that's going to keep the level of dust below hazardous levels, clean that material. And the thing that I like about the SonicAire fan systems is that they take care of that for you in some of the most dangerous places. So the dust that it gets fugitive and wafts up really high is generally the driest. It's also generally the smallest particle size. Those are the two parameters that affect dust combustibility the most. So that's like the dangerous dust is up above people's heads, up in these rafters. So when you have an event that gets rained down, and the SonicAire systems then are there to sort of stop that from happening, to keep that below off that equipment. And the thing that I really like, and it's something that you told me early, Jordan, and it sort of clicked in my head. It's like, well, most people clean, when it gets above the hazardous threshold.
Right.
Like you're waiting for a hazard to happen.
Right.
before you clean. So these systems are going all the time.
That's right.
And not letting that happen. And it just always stuck with me because there's always going to be that balance of, okay, well, should we shut down the plant and clean today?
Yeah.
Or if there's always a production rush, and there's always a production rush,
right.
It's always going to be, okay, well, let's just wait a little bit longer. Let's schedule once a quarter instead of once a month or whatever. And you're always, spending 25% or 50% of your time or more in hazardous conditions. If you're a facility that's even doing that.
That's right.
So there's a bunch under clean to do it safe. And I really like the role that SonicAire plays in that, because I think it's a novel approach and one that's really useful for that.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. All right, let's any final thoughts on explosions and problems outside of the equipment before we move on into the equipment?
Yeah, I'd just say, well, two things. So one, if you have questions while you're listening to this, and I see the audience keeps piling in here, so put those in the Q&A box, and we're going to have a section at the end of the presentation to talk about that, or the end of the interview, I guess. I did do slides, but then Jordan said, no, let's just talk. So and I'm being just a discussion, which was good. So that's number one. Number two is, if you just don't know what to do, that's why we created Dust Safety Professionals. It's okay to go in there and say, my name is John. I don't know what to do. Somebody said this. And that exact reason is the gap that we created DSP for. It's like, how do we get that person to move towards safety? So that's not 2 years later and they're still like, I don't know what to do. So if you know what to do, that's great. Go DSP, put it in there. Use a Gmail account if you want, and don't put in your name. Going to make it a little bit harder, but do that. We can have a dialogue and figure out and connect with the right people. Most people, at least what companies that are working with the materials and stuff. But that'd be the last I would say. That's just sort of the first step on facility assessment before getting into things like DHAs and NFPA 652.
Excellent. Okay. All right. Let's talk about inside the equipment. Where do we go from there?
So we talked about contain, collect, clean. Just for the sake of adding another geometric shape to an already geometric shape filled slide deck for combustible dust, we call the dust safety hexagon the other three elements. So if you imagine 6 sides, it's contain, collect, clean, and the other sides are prevent, protect, isolate. You can do prevention, protection, and isolation outside of equipment, but generally you're talking about then doing that inside equipment as the other sides of the dust safety hexagon, if you will. And because of the very broad knowledge needed to evaluate these hazards, it can be quite difficult. I'll give you some examples. Imperial sugar, clogged silo leads to explosion, propagates through a duct, blows out a floor, leads to dust raining down and full facility loss, or loss of a large section of the
catastrophic facility. For sure.
Catastrophic, big event. We have other events where it's just a bucket elevator, explosion propagates through, zips open, and injures employees. I see someone on the call who I personally talked to about an incident his team witnessed, where it was just a bag dump station. They've done 1,000 bag dumps before, and one day, whatever the reason, if it emptied quicker or there was charge built up on the bags or whatever, it ignited and engulfed the worker. So we have like very disparate size and scales, very disparate materials. So it can be quite a challenge to wrap your head around all the different hazards with combustible dust. And I always say, well, wouldn't it be great if you had a systematic way to do that? And that is what NFPA 652 is trying to provide to us, the end users of the code. It's okay, well, here's a systematic way to walk through and figure out those hazards. The terminology used in 652 is a dust hazard analysis. This will include hazards outside the equipment, but also includes the hazards inside the equipment. That's really the next step after you've done your screening. Say, okay, or opted in, say, yep, we have a combustible dust. What do we need to do here? It's walking through and understanding and completing that dust hazard analysis.
So again, I don't know what to do. I don't know. This is the first time I'm hearing about a dust hazard analysis, or I've heard about them in maybe industry meetings and things like that. Where do I begin? How do I get started doing a dust hazard analysis? It sounds complicated. How does that work?
Well, it in concept, it's easy to say. There's a nice flow chart. It's just, I'm going off memory, so forgive me if I forget a step, but screen your materials, opt in or opt out. do your material characterization, understand the fire and flash fire hazards of those materials, walk through each part of your facility and say, where are the flash fire, explosion hazards, identify what kind of loss they might cause, and identify any gaps between your prescriptive requirements outlined in whatever standard set you're using. Generally, people use NFPA 652 as the umbrella, and then all the other NFPA standards. You could be speccing against your own internal standards, though, or some international standard as well. But that's the identifying the gaps between where you're at and those prescriptive requirements, developing an implementation plan to close those gaps, and then any specific concerns for your industry and management systems, which there are a lot of them. So we talked about housekeeping already as one management system, employee training, emergency response preparedness, which we'll talk about in a second. There's about another 8 or 9 that are listed in 652. It's like a very systematic way of saying, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, to evaluate all the hazards at your facility.
Sure. I think there's a template for a DHA in the appendix of NFPA 652. Isn't that right?
There is.
Yeah. So if you're not familiar with that, nfpa.org, and you can go there and register and view a copy of NFPA 652 there and take a look at the appendix. And there's a template there that you can download or print off or create your own and work through that. And then, Chris, you have resources available as well. If people say, I'm not into that, really complicated, can I just hire somebody, a consultant, to come in and help us do that? You've got resources for that as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things there. So the appendix in 652 is a really good reference. There's another book called Guidelines for Combustible Dust Hazard Analysis, published by the Center for Chemical Process Safety, CCPS. That's a really good reference too. And they actually talk about it in this hazards outside equipment, inside equipment, the sort of framework we're talking about here. And they have very good walkthrough examples as well. So those are kind of the place you go. And there's the biggest challenge today with DHAs is who can do them, and who magically grants the power to people to be able to do them, which is, the answer is no one. Sort of. The EHA is the final say, but generally the EHA doesn't have the understanding to say if you're competent to be able to do a DHA or not. So there are avenues where you could train employees yourselves to do a functioning DHA. And then there's avenues where it's better to hire somebody. Now, does it make sense to talk about those sort of things? Because that's something we put a lot of brain space into at Dust Safety Science, figuring out what is, who do we want to call a qualified person for the sake of dust safety professionals?
Right. I think the standard does say competent, I think, is what they try to define there. Yeah.
So we really see it as 3 things. So this is the Dust Safety Science, Dust Safety Professionals version of it. This is something that I presented at NFPA's conference this year. Is you need 3 components to be a qualified person, in my view. Again, this isn't an NFPA view. It's nobody else's view but ours, but at least it's something to put out there. You need a broad understanding and experience of combustible dust hazards. You need to have specific understanding of the equipment and materials you're working in, and demonstrable experience performing or leading DHAs in the past. And the reason you need these 3 things is, if you worked in feed and grain for a long time, that's great. Maybe you even sat in some DHAs, but if you don't know combustible dust and the fundamentals, you're going to miss stuff when you evaluate the hazards.
Sure.
If you study combustible dust, you did the courses from NFPA, this came out a really great course. And maybe you even work in feed and grain. Should you do a DHA in the newest nano titanium metal printer? Well, probably not. If you don't have that specific material or industry experience. Now, if you have both those things, you just never done a DHA, but you're probably going to miss some of the framework, some of the steps.
Right. So
then the question really becomes, how do we hire somebody who has these 3 things, or how do we develop somebody on our team who has these 3 things? And I'd encourage that to be the first question. Before it's like, okay, who can find the checklist and do the DHA here? I would stop and say, well, okay, how do we develop somebody as a qualified person? And what you'll probably find is, if you have one site and you're doing it one time, it's probably going to be cheaper to hire somebody external than to train somebody up. If you have multiple sites, or if you have a lot of change processes and you want to come back and reevaluate your DHA over time, then train somebody up. But you need to walk through those steps of making them a qualified person, because you're going to miss things otherwise.
Sure. All right. I don't want to run out of time before we get to these 3 bullet points here for sure. But pre-planning and responses to fires and thermal events. Unpack that for us a little bit.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. So we talk about hazards inside equipment, hazards outside equipment, facility assessments, dust hazard analysis. That's a lot of the stuff you're going to see when you Google, how do I deal with combustible dust? Well, if you Google that, you're probably going to come up with one of our platforms. that's why we create them. But we run this instant database, and every year we record almost 100, probably even more than 100, actually 1,000 over 5 years. So we're averaging 150 to 200 a year.
Wow.
And we want to say, what is the common methods of loss? And one of the big things that comes up that's not addressed is this response to fires. And it's not the question comes after. It's like, well, what is a fire? Is a fire a big flaming thing that we see, or is it, could it be black flecks in our output stream? So we actually created a working group at our conference last year and said, okay, who wants to tackle this problem? We got a team of 8 people together. We've been working on it for about 6 months, and it'll probably take us another 6 months to kind of get the final report and stuff together. But it's about identifying what are the common factors associated with loss from fires and thermal events. And the framework is prepare, recognize, respond, and recover. So if you just don't recognize you have a thermal event, that often will lead to that escalating to an explosion. There's a current chemical safety board investigation going on at, I think the town's called Bell, but I don't know what state it's in. I can't remember what state it's in. But they haven't released a report. They released like an update. They said, okay, before the incident happened, in the sort of time leading up to it, there were black flecks noticed in the output. So that's what I mean about recognize. It's like, well, is that a thermal event, and how can that lead to an explosion? Go ahead.
You're really talking about the warning signs, the precursors, the primary, it's a near miss. It's a primary event that hasn't led to that catastrophic secondary event yet. So how do we address that and make that a priority so that we never have that secondary catastrophic event?
How do we recognize it? How do we respond in a safer way? And how do we recover? So respond, do we have sprinklers that are going to kick in and land on burning hot metal dust and cause an explosion? Or are employees trained with fire extinguishers and maybe kick that up and cause an explosion in the facility? And then recover when you turn it back on. Okay, is that gap mill clean enough? And turned out when you turn it back on, there's still a smoldering mass in there, pulled through the pneumatic conveying system, and you have explosion blows inside your building. When I say maybe, the whole goal as a working group, we pulled out, I think, 80 incidents of exactly those cases. And those are real things. They're not maybes. They're cases that have caused loss from not recognizing, not responding in a safe manner, or recovering. It all points back to, okay, how do we prepare for these thermal events and fire events in a better way? How do we train our employees to recognize, respond, and recover? So I don't have the steps for that yet, other than start thinking about your emergency preparedness. What are you calling an emergency? Do people run towards the issue? Do they run away from the issue? When do you call a fire department in? What are they wearing when they run to a, don't run. If it's emergency, walk. It's been shown to have better outcomes. Well, what are they wearing? Are they wearing Tyvek suits? They don't fare too well in thermal flash fires. Are they wearing regular clothes? It also doesn't, the dust particles get trapped underneath the clothes and cause really bad burns. So there's a whole branch of that, and it's not well documented. There's guidance between a bunch of different stakeholders, and that's the whole purpose of the working group, is pull together and say, okay, well, just where should people go to try to figure this out? So that's the third thing I'd say, is start thinking about your emergency planning. How do you deal with fires and thermal events?
Sure. Excellent. All right. We've got a couple of questions that have popped in here. So
Great.
You mentioned reviewing the DHA. So how often should that be done? Is that identified in the standard? Is that a rule of thumb? Is that just general practice? What should be the accepted review cycle for the DHAs?
Yeah, so good question. Let me just pull up, because I got, I'm using NFPA Link. This is like a show to an NFPA product, but I'm using NFPA Link now.
Okay.
if you're a regular code user, you should look at it. It's like the cost of one code document a year.
Oh, wow.
And it's really good. So I've just found they don't pay me for giving me shit. It's just really that much better than flipping through paper copies. So in terms of the general requirements, then see, after I talked it all up, I'm not sure where it is in the document, but I think it's every 5 years or sooner, depending on when your changes are that you're doing your facility. That's the keynote. If you're making changes, if you're adding parts to your facility, you really need to have that being a living and breathing document to move forward with. I'm surprised it's not in this part of the standard. I will find that as we talk.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Here's an interesting question. So how do I convince upper level management to spend money on dust controls and dust mitigation?
Yeah, great question. It's like the $1 million question. It's the thing that
literally,
well, it is the $1 million question. And I say, it's all good to say, for me to get up here and say as an independent researcher, and that we should do it to save lives and limb. And that's true. And that's, why lives come to work. But does that move the needle in safety? And historically, maybe it hasn't. So we do need to get better at what we're affectionately calling selling safety at the moment, because I have no better name for it. But I would encourage you, if you're in a position where you need to have that influence, if you look at the PSM literature, they say, the process safety management literature, that you need to have upper level buy-in, but they don't necessarily tell you how to do it.
Right.
What I'd say is start to document the true cost of what's going on. I've seen this be successful with health and safety managers, where you just ask, well, how much that cost you last year to have fires, flash fires, explosions, and you don't know the answer because it generally gets pulled into just operating expenses. It doesn't get broken out. So that fire that burned up your bags and your dust collector, well, that just goes under, that $20,000 or $80,000 loss, or whatever it is, just went under operating expenses. So you sort of, it's going to take some work on your end, but if you sort of start tracking that on your own, or if you get support to say, hey, we should track this, you'll see that there is actually a cost associated with non-improvement of your safety system, from hard costs, replacing equipment, from downtime, from employee injury to employee compensation payments. And after doing that for a year, then you can go to your management and say, hey, we lost $150,000 or $1.5 million or $15,000, depending on if you're a one-man wood shop to a food processor, on replacement of fires and flash fires and downtime from quote unquote small deflagrations. And they're going to go, well, holy smokes, fix that. And you go, well, okay, here's a $20,000 investment we can make. And we think we can reduce that by 75% or something. That's the process I've been recommending. And I have seen success in some industries where health and safety managers can do that. That's something, if you have input or questions or feedback, send them to Jordan on that specific thing. I'd love to bounce some ideas off other people that are in that position to say, hey, what are some other ways we can sell safety? That's what I'm telling people. Try to pull that out of OpEx, operating expenses, and give you a denominator to actually measure the performance of your safety system against. Because right now the denominator is 0, then you can't. Actually, it's infinity. That doesn't make sense. But you get the point. You need something to measure against.
It's kind of how much risk are you comfortable with, and what kind of insurance in the form of dust control and dust protection can you put in place to protect the loss of life and limb? And not only that, but protect against the loss of production or the catastrophic devastation of your facility or something like that as well.
Yeah, and I just, the last, I know I'm kind of harping on, but the point I want to hit on is, most of the time when you have a large facility or even a small facility, flash fire, there's a history there. And the question is, how much that history cost them over the last 5 years? If they had to recognize the cost, maybe we could prevent it by putting something in. And we've done this a couple of times where on the podcast, I've done episodes tracking a company over time that we don't give a name to, and watch them track themselves out of business by burning up bags, by injuring, not by causing fatalities, because then they become exposed in the media, and that's a whole nother thing you should probably put in your calculation. But they actually, because of unsafe acts, end up going out of business because of loss of competitiveness, because of local, local community suing them because their plant smells because they burned up their scrubber.
Yeah.
All these things sort of happen and can cause these challenges.
Yeah. All right. I think we are almost out of time. So just real quick, hit those 3 points one more time. Just summarize those for us before we get out of here.
Yeah. So the 3 things, on-site facility assessment is generally the first step. Unless unless you're asking you want to do a DHA, then you can do your screening test and move forward or just opt in. But if you have questions about that, just get somebody on to say, hey, what does this look like? And generally they're going to be looking at hazards outside of equipment. We didn't really talk a lot about ignition sources, but that's one part they'll look at. And where's the fuel? Where's the dust at? Dust hazard analysis then extends that to hazards inside equipment in more of a holistic view, more comprehensive view, and your emergency response plan. There's a whole bunch of avenues to that. And I think there's actually an FPA standard on it. But the big one that we're seeing a lot of loss on is a thermal event is occurring, and during the recognition, response, or recovery of that event, it gets escalated to an explosion. And we don't have a good number, but like at least a quarter, maybe up to half of the large incidents we're seeing have this leading indicator, not just like leading indicator, like it's happened a couple of times over the past, like the hours leading up to and minutes leading up to the explosion, there was a fire or a thermal event going on that if recognized, responded to appropriately, or recovered from, would have stopped from happening.
There's a warning sign there somewhere. Yeah.
And two callbacks. So it is every 5 years for DHA as per 652 7.1.4. And insidious. I just thought of the word
insidious.
So the Chemical Safety Board said it's an insidious hazard. And if you look at insidious, it says something like, if you look at the Webster dictionary, it's like sits around and does nothing until it does something bad.
It's the sleeping giant. Let's just call it the sleeping giant.
Yeah, you got it.
All right, Chris, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. I've learned a lot. This has been very helpful for me, as I'm out at trade shows and in facilities and talking with people. I know these are important tips and piece of information that people can go out and start doing something. And I think that's the first step, is just be active, do something. Don't just say, oh, that was some great information, and throw it in a file. But actually take this information out and do something with it to make your facility a little bit safer for you and your employees and your coworkers. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. If people want to learn more about dust safety science, where should they go?
Yeah, if you're listening to this, you must like listening to people's voices, or maybe you just wanted to tune in to see me or Jordan. If that's true, if you listen to things in your car, like podcasts, or at the gym, or while working or walking or whatever, Dust Safety Science podcast. We have over 100 hours of me and other people talking about combustible dust. Everything from survivor stories to large loss investigations to like every little nook and cranny of the research universe. That's one area to go. If you want to know more in terms of knowledge education, the Dust Safety Academy is the place to go. We have 1,000 members there today of people that are trying to increase their understanding of combustible dust. If you need help, if you don't know where to start, dust safety professionals, go there and we'll get you rolling with your dust safety program. Or if you do have a program in place and you just have a question on some specific aspect, we have the experts in the world, from Malaysia to Japan to UK to Scotland, I guess same place, but all over the place. We're trying to collect them all up at Dust Safety Professionals to say, okay, well, this is how we get you moving on your next steps.
Yeah. And Chris is on LinkedIn and very active. So if you're on LinkedIn, follow Chris there. You can follow me there. I'm Jordan Newton. If you want more information on specifically fugitive dust solutions, check us out at SonicAire.com or email us at moreinfo@SonicAire.com. Thank you for attending and listening with us today.